Welcome to the Good and Basic podcast. This time with a very special guest. We're speaking with Pete Judo, who has a master's degree in, I want to get this right, behavioral and economic science. Pete has worked for Rory Sutherland, who is a creative powerhouse and a luminary in the area of marketing and consumer behavior, and when irrational behavior actually is the most rational way to go about doing something. In this conversation, kind of the themes that we're hoping to explore are things related to UBI, whether or not that is a sustainable idea, some studies that have come out recently in that area, and also, if that isn't going to work, what other strategies can we try to mitigate the potential downsides of AI? Pete, I first ran into your work through a video that you did on universal basic income. Would you mind briefly giving a synopsis of what that topic was and why it surprised you so much?
Sure. So I did a video on UBI, and it came out of my interest in a recent mega study from a company called Open Research, which is sort of a research division sponsored by Sam Altman, who's the owner of OpenAI and ChatGPT. And so they did this very interesting study that was funded by himself, where they gave a bunch of Americans $1,000 per month for 12 months. And when they did this, they compared this group who they gave $1,000 to a group who they only gave $50 to act as the control, and they measured a whole bunch of different stuff, financial outcomes, health outcomes, happiness outcomes, and then the reporting on it was very positive. So I was like, oh, great, UBI seems to work wonderfully. All these major media outlets, Bloomberg, etc., were like reporting very positively that UBI seems to be a great success on this mega study that has, it's hard to do a UBI study of this scale. So I was very excited by the results. And then I actually looked at the papers, right, which I think very few people do. Most people just read the articles and they don't bother reading the paper, right? So I actually read the papers. I was like, these papers seem way less positive than what the media outlets are reporting and what Open Research's own website is showing. And then I look into it, I actually realized that the actual results from the UBI study were pretty negative, to be honest. There was, in terms of financial outcomes, which is what I was most concerned with in the video, people ended up being $1,000 poorer in terms of net worth compared to the control group, right? Which is crazy, because if you give somebody $36,000 and they end up being $1,000 poorer on average, you're like, well, what's gone on here, right? I gave you $36,000 for free. How come you're poorer than your equivalent who didn't receive that? So that was kind of the main point of the video, that you have to be kind of careful about how media reports about things, about how companies have alternate incentives to report things in a certain way. And so it's better just to, to train yourself to read actual papers on stuff that you're interested in. Then you actually you can see the results better for yourself, see the data for yourself. And yeah, it wasn't as positive. And I got a lot of very interesting criticisms and comments, but so I addressed those comments by saying that actually it's not just that, like, financial outcomes is one thing which I focused on in the video, but actually there was no measurable increase in long-term health, no measurable increase in long-term mental health, no measurable increase in long-term happiness. They were just $1,000 poorer, and nothing else had changed, basically. So
I think they mentioned that people were slightly more likely to go to the dentist, but other than that, that seems like scratching the bottom of the barrel.
Sure. Yeah, exactly. And so this reporting was fascinating to me, because they very much had, or OpenAI had very much cherry-picked results, because they measured so many things that it was basically impossible for there to be no positives, right? If you measure like 150 things, then like a few of them are going to be positive, right? And so they took the most positive sounding ones and they fed those to the media, and that's what ended up getting reported, when sort of what in my opinion should be like the big picture, main headline outcomes that they should be measuring, those things weren't reported for some reason.
That's so fascinating. So there's a few moving parts here. There's the expectation for UBI. There's the interest that OpenAI in particular has in UBI. And then I would love to hear more about the criticisms that you dealt with the video. It's always interesting to see what gets highlighted in the comments section. That's never
Sure.
quite
Yeah.
predictable. What surprised you the most from the feedback that you received from the video?
Yeah. So a lot of people were sort of criticizing my point of view for being too focused on the financials or too focused
Mm,
on the economics. And I think that's a fair criticism. Obviously, my background is in economics. I'm a behavioral economist by training. So I work at a bank, right? So I'm very much concerned with like how is people's financial well-being. And so to me, it's like, okay, if we're going to give thousands of Americans $36,000 for free, how does that affect their financial well-being? Surely it would improve it, right? Like at the very least, you would think, give people $1,000 a month for free, they can at least put $1,000 towards their mortgage or $1,000 towards their whatever other loan or debt or student loan or whatever, right? So if they just did that and changed nothing else about their life, they would be in a much better financial position after 3 years. Um, but instead, we see people actually being poorer. So people were criticizing me for saying that I'm too focused on that, and actually, like, these people are so poor that they just want to have a good time. Give people some free money. It doesn't paying off the little bit of debt isn't going to help them. So they did the right thing of just wasting their money on leisure activities or just trying to be
describing that as the
happy.
right thing is quite odd.
Yeah. So that was, there was that criticism. There was also, I talked about how there was also a reduction in work hours, average work hours for people who received $1,000. So while you didn't see like major withdrawal from the labor force, which is what some people speculated would happen with UBI, right? You did see people on average reduce the number of hours that they worked by like 1.3 to 1.4 hours a week. And again, it's not a huge amount, but it's just showing that like people are working less. And I frame that as a negative thing in the video. It's not necessarily a negative thing, obviously. Like if somebody's working like over way too many hours and they have a bad quality of life, then yeah, sure, a small reduction in hours would be a positive thing. But like I said, when you actually look at the other, you would think, okay, 1.4 hours less work is positive if that means you have an increase in your overall happiness, right, after 3 years,
Right.
right, or your overall quality of life in some other way. But again, when you look at the other long-term measures over the 3 years, at the end of the 3-year program, the long-term measures are back to baseline again, exactly where they were in the beginning. And so you just have people working less and they're not happier.
That is so interesting. So, one of the things that fascinates me about economics in general is that because it is the study of value, it is exceedingly complicated. Are you familiar with the is-ought divide from Hume's philosophy?
I'm not. Enlighten
I'll
me.
give the super brief summary of it. Uh, David Hume, Scottish philosopher, proposed an idea that whenever an argument is made for a moral, with a moral conclusion, there's always a skip in the logic, always. Because you'll start with a bunch of fact statements. This is so, this is so, this is so. And eventually you jump from the descriptive to the normative with a leap in logic that's very, very difficult to explain how that works. He says you cannot derive an ought statement from an is statement. But economics is an interesting science in this regard because it is a science, it is descriptive, but it's also inherently normative because you're covering the subject of value. There's what is better, what is worse, what is a good outcome, what is a bad outcome, what is greater value, even when we're talking about these studies. And so it's kind of turtles all the way down. With, I think it would be helpful with the UBI study to talk briefly about what was hoped for with this study so that we can set up kind of the expectation versus the result in a clearer way. I think it's easier to avoid moving the goalposts if we have that clear picture in the beginning. As I understand it, the main idea is AI is coming. We're afraid we're all going to be put out of a job. And so wouldn't it be nice to have strings-free money to solve that problem in the future? Is that a fair summary?
I mean, that wasn't. Here's the thing, right? When you do scientific research, you normally have a very clear hypothesis and a very clear set of specific outcome measures that you're looking for, and you set your hypothesis about, okay, I want these outcome measures to move by a certain in this direction based off our intervention, right? That's how you normally do scientific research. But in this particular study, they didn't really do that. So to say that the implied motive from the work that Open Research and OpenAI do is that, yes, as you described, that like UBI will help solve this issue of AI replacing people's jobs, and people will have some free income and can live on that. However, that wasn't stated anywhere in the research papers, right? The research papers just kind of gave people money and measured a bunch of stuff, right? Which is it's a very sneaky way of doing research. I understand why they did it, but it's a very sneaky way of doing research because it's basically like you can't fail, right? If you do that, because no one can look back and say, "Oh, you said you were gonna, you're gonna do this," and then it didn't happen, right? Like they didn't do that. They just gave people money and they said, "We're gonna measure like 1,000 million different things," and then once you get the results after 3 years, you can pick and choose which of those things tell the best story, and that's the story that you end up telling, right? So
That's so
that's
interesting.
pretty much what they did. Um, yeah, and
This sort of study is like a dietary study. There's a lot of things that go into diet. It's an incredibly difficult thing to measure, and so observational studies are problematic because there's too many factors moving into. It's difficult to set up what a control would even be, because
well,
you would have to measure every single thing a person consumed in terms of diet. So this sort of observational study, just collecting a broad range of data, you have to. I mean, the data is there, so it can contradict and falsify some theories, but it doesn't seem like a well constructed experiment to falsify a particular theory. Is that a good summary?
yeah, exactly. And it was very much a let's give a bunch of Americans a bunch of money and just see what happens, and then we're just going to measure everything and then report on it. And yeah, so it is very much a fail safe way of doing research. Like it's impossible to do research that way and not have a positive story at the end of it.
Interesting, because there's always going to be some positive story that you can pull out of the facts, given, and even based off of pure randomness, you'll be able to find something there.
Yeah,
With You mentioned that there was a control. So two groups of Americans, some given $1,000 per month, some given $50 per month as a control.
yeah.
And it surprised me that they used a group of people given $50 a month as a control. I mean, rather than people receiving none.
Yeah.
Could you explain a little bit
I mean,
about why that was chosen?
I assume they needed to incentivize people to participate, right? Because
Okay.
these if you want people to like the outcome measures are self-report, so you're basically asking these people to fill out surveys on a regular basis, and these surveys are pretty long and they're pretty extensive because they're measuring 1,000 different things. And so if you want to get people to participate, you got to pay them a bit of money, so they pay them $50 a month, right? But if you do the maths, right, like $50 a month over 3 years, it's only $1,800 after 3 years, right? It's not like not a, it's not an insignificant amount of money, but it's not like a life changing amount of money for most people, right? Whereas like $36,000, that's a pretty that makes more of a dent, right? And so that's the difference you're comparing here. So effectively, the people receiving $50 a month are receiving close to zero, right? They're just being paid for their time, basically, to fill out the survey.
With the result that you have highlighted, that they have those who received the $3,600 over the 3 years ended up $1,000 poorer in terms of their net worth.
$36,000.
36,000. Did I say 3,600?
Yeah,
Excuse me.
36,000.
That's
Big
wild.
distinction. Yeah, right. Because it's just it's
I
three
missed a
months, right?
zero.
12 times three, $36,000 a
Yeah,
month, $36,000.
the
Yeah.
math checks out. I must have misspoke. Excuse me. That is
Anyways.
incredible. I mean, even if that was going purely toward debt reduction, you would have
Yeah.
seen an increase in their net worth by a lot.
Yeah.
So, what do you make of that? Are people not oriented toward building wealth and building net worth? Do you think that's just like a mental space that's not being considered, so that it goes straight toward income and gets spent as part of the monthly cash flow?
Undoubtedly, financial literacy plays a role, right? So if these people receiving the money were not particularly financially literate, then they may not see the value of paying off their debt today. right? And in behavioral economics and behavioral science, one of the main concepts we talk about is how people just really struggle to appreciate the concept of interest, right? Of compound interest. And that applies to like investments, but that also applies to debt, right? And so if you're like paying off a little bit of debt today is worth way more than paying off that debt in the future, because now that debt is not accumulated compound interest over time, right? And so you have to be somewhat financially literate to appreciate that fact. Um, and so yeah, so I think that's one part of it. But another part of it, and the point I make in the video is that, first of all, I'm not against UBI as a concept. Like I didn't go into this video as someone who doesn't like UBI as a concept. I actually was, from a theoretical point of view, a big supporter of UBI. But the version of UBI that I think generally works better from the evidence that I've seen is a lump sum amount of money as opposed to piecemeal, like $1,000 a month. So imagine rather than receiving $1,000 a month, you receive $12,000 on the 1st of January, right? And then nothing for the rest of the year. So the amount of money you're giving these people is exactly the same. It's $12,000. But the difference is when you have $12,000, you can actually make some pretty substantial purchases. And it kind of changes the way you think about the money, right? Like $1,000 extra a month, that's increasing your monthly income, right? And so then what we ended up seeing was people. Sorry?
It makes you feel rich in a spendthrift sort of way. Like
In a
suddenly
spendthrift
your
sort of
purchasing
way.
power is greater, but you don't think of it in terms of where do I put this?
Yeah, where do I put this? Where do I invest this? It's a different mindset. And we see this not just in UBI, but with people who progress, through their career, that their incomes, people's incomes generally increase throughout their career, right, as they, get promoted and whatnot. But sometimes people get promoted, their incomes increase, but their financial position doesn't improve. So why is that the case? Well, it's because they simply expand their lifestyle, right? So with more money, I'm going to expand my lifestyle. My expenditure is going to get bigger. I'm going to buy a bigger house. I'm going to take out a bigger mortgage. I'm going to buy fancier food, whatever it is. And so my actual financial position, like the amount of financial resilience or the amount of like money saved I have in the bank, is not going to be increasing over that period, even though my income has increased so much. And so I think that's kind of what we saw here. Like we saw people engaging in more leisure. We saw people taking out more debt rather than paying off their existing debt. They took out more debt, which means they were like buying bigger mortgages, or they were leasing more expensive cars, etc. And so that's why we see this lack of improvement in financial position. However, if you receive $12,000 on the 1st of January, then your mindset might be a bit different. You're like, I got this chunk of money now, right? Am I going to increase my monthly lifestyle, or am I going to put all this money towards one thing straight away, right? So it could be the example I give is like, paying for a new car, right? Say you're somebody who previously had to take public transport wherever you went, right? With $12,000, you can then buy a cheap car, and that's going to like significantly improve your quality of life, but also improve your like ability to work, because maybe you can go to jobs that you couldn't do before or whatever, or you could become an Uber driver or whatever, right? And so that's just one example, right? Obviously everyone's individual situation is different. Or like I said, at the very least, you just get $12,000, you go, sweet, that's $12,000 off my mortgage, right? And then you're straight away then reaping the rewards of that with lower mortgage repayments. And so so that's the version of UBI that I advocate for more. I just generally think that people seem to invest the money differently. Like when you receive a lump sum, it changes your mindset quite significantly.
Absolutely, absolutely, and I think it's fascinating. So we've got this division between income and, if you grow as a goldfish, don't just grow the size of your tank, or I think the other way around. If you grow the tank, don't grow the size of the goldfish, because then you can't go down in the size of the tank.
Right.
As my income has grown, I've noticed that I have expanded. There was a time not too long ago when I was a high school science teacher, and I supported myself and two children and my wife on $36,000 a year. like a
Right.
very, very small amount, and it was sufficient. I was able to get by. Granted, housing prices were lower then,
Yeah.
but as I'm now an attorney, I'm making a little bit more than that, and finances feel tighter than they did then, which is a fascinating thing for me to explore and say, okay, where have I expanded? Where can I retrench? Where can we correct this so that we can see, gains in the future?
Right. Right. Yeah, and I think that's what happened with this study. It seems, yeah, people are just expanding their lifestyle. And the interesting thing about expanding your lifestyle is that it doesn't generally increase your long-term happiness, right? So this is something again which we see from behavioral science. I didn't touch on this in the video, but I'll talk to you about it now. So um, basically, people habituate to whatever their situation is, right? And so, say for example, you get gifted a new car, like a nice, right, and like a nice brand new car. And in the beginning, you're like, this is amazing, right? And you're like,
Yeah.
this car is so much better than my old car, blah 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 blah. But then, like, after you use it every day for like 3 months, you're like, you're still happy you have the car, but it's reduced, right? And so, and then basically, the longer this time period goes on, the less happiness you feel from your new lifestyle of having this new car. And so that is exactly what we saw in the happiness data from this study as well. Is that like in the beginning, these people got $1,000 extra a month. They expanded their lifestyle. They were super happy. And then you get to the third year and they're like back to baseline again, right? And their happiness is exactly the same as it was in the beginning. So,
I would
um,
be fascinated to see the happiness data the month after the study ended because loss aversion is a huge thing. If you're given
mm,
$5, the increase in happiness is not as large as the decrease in happiness if the same five is taken away from you later.
yeah. And to be fair, this is actually one of the fair criticisms that my commenters had, which was that in the third year, you know that that's the last year of the study, and so maybe that's why people were less happy.
You
They knew
know,
that it was coming to an end. Um, but I don't know. I mean, yeah, it's hard to distinguish. Either explanation could be true. You need another study to prove which one is true. So
well,
yeah,
sign me up. I'll sign up as tribute for that study.
yeah. I'll sign up too. I'd love $36,000 for free.
That
Sounds
sounds
great.
great. I will not complain one little bit. It's fascinating when you're describing the your preferred way to handle a universal basic income. So, in the same interest, in the interest of supporting people, helping them to get better financial footing, putting them in a better place long term. Um, Prioritizing not only the short term but the long term through the use of an increase in their net worth. Uh, there's an idea that I would love to just throw into the conversation and ask you to assess. So there's an economist in the 1930s in the United States named Ralph Borsodi. He's a self-taught economist. He wrote a number of books on factories, on advertising, inefficiencies due to advertising as companies try to compete with each other. And he did an experiment trying to homestead and grow most of his own food and provide more of his necessities of life himself as an economic exercise. And the received wisdom is that economies of scale and mass buying and division of labor, all these things are going to make home scale manufacturing horribly underproductive and inefficient and bad. And there's a lot of truth there, but he found that there were some offsets. For instance, being able to completely eliminate certain bills increased his bargaining power in his employment contracts because his ability to go a longer distance of time without income was greater than his peers. So if, for instance, Mr. Borsodi was a factory worker and he decided that he needed to go on a strike, his position was very strong because he could do it relatively indefinitely. And that kind of capital, I mean, it's not monetary capital exactly. It was, machinery and buildings on a small farmstead on cheap land that he found outside of New York, which probably doesn't exist anymore. But what was fascinating to me was the idea that he wanted that to turn into a government program. During the 1930s, during the Great Depression, there were a lot of aid packages put together through the New Deal. and he did a cost calculation for how much, similar to a UBI, was being spent to support families that were out of work. And he said if you were to take the same amount of capital, that same $36,000, you could equip a bare bones homestead and put them in a position to support themselves indefinitely without having to make the same expense year over year over year. And so you could permanently remove the problem. What are your thoughts on that, especially as we're moving toward, robot gardeners and other technologies on the horizon?
Yeah. So with any welfare system, right? There's always this tension between like how much oversight should you give people with the money that you're giving them, right? And at the moment, the version that exists, I'm not totally familiar with the American system, but from my understanding, um, it's pretty paternal, right? So the government says like you get certain benefits if you have children, you get certain benefits if you have a disability, you have certain benefit, right? And like there's so many, and then there's like obviously there's like means tested allowances and all these different things, and so it's like there's a million different factors that are determining how much money you get, and then the government, then I believe, I'm not, correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe the way that it works is that they sort of monitor how you're spending the money in some ways, um, and so that's kind of similar to what this guy you're talking about is saying. Is like we rather than we give you $36,000 and then you do what you want with it, instead we're going to set it up for you to make sure that you're not wasting it,
The
right?
paternal aspect is very interesting. I have a little bit of background there. I used to be an administrative judge overseeing the food stamps program.
Okay.
That was my first legal job after law school, and it was an amazing experience. Very interesting just for the people watching opportunities. It, that is a means tested program that supports families under certain income thresholds with food purchases. They get a credit card which they can use at grocery stores that opt into the program. And there are some limitations in what they can purchase with that credit card. Certain transactions are flagged, so purchases of alcohol, cigarettes, certain candies, things like that are not permitted, and it has to be a food item, so you can't buy diapers with it. But
Right.
uh, there are huge problems with gaps in those programs and a lot of inefficiencies in the oversight. And I got to see
Yeah.
both of those firsthand. In some ways, I was an inefficiency. My entire salary was based on observing what other people were doing, which is money that is not going to supporting someone who needs it, unless you count me,
Sure. Yeah.
for sure. But one of the more heartrending hearings that I had to do frequently was there's a net and a gross income maximum that you can have. There are some calculations. If you're over the gross income maximum, you can't participate in the program. There's nothing you can do. It's based on the number of members of your household. And so I got to see some hearings, oversee some hearings, and write decisions where people would cheat by claiming people were parts of their household that weren't. Frequently, ex-lovers or children who had been removed from their custody. The On the income side, though, there was an uncanny valley where you would be just over the income threshold, but still in dire need of support. And because those income thresholds are moved only by acts of Congress, they don't keep up with inflation. They don't keep up with economic downturns. They don't keep up with a lot
Right.
of the things that you would need them to be responsive to if they were really going to be fair.
Yeah. And this is what I've heard from a lot of people as well, right? Is that like the welfare system in America is very inefficient and inadequate. And that's one of the main arguments in favor of UBI is that you get rid of a lot of this admin, which would include your former job, unfortunately, right? But you get rid of a lot of this cost, which again is like you say is cost that is not being put towards helping the people who really need it. Um, and
If I'm not
then
mistaken, that was Andrew
you
Yang's major argument in his 2020 presidential run,
right because he
was
had a
just
version
trying
of
to
UBI that
eliminate the
he advocated
inefficiency.
for, the freedom dividend, and it also you also kind of I feel like it's less what's the word, like you trust people more with UBI, right? You say I trust you're not going to just spend this all at the casino, right? And then you're actually
And
going
if you
to,
do, that's on you, not on us.
that's on you, But like we think on balance, most people will not do that. Um, and so that's kind of what the main thing in favor of UBI. And in a way, it should be way more efficient if that's true, because um, not only do you get rid of all this administrative cost, but also people can then allocate that money to whatever they specifically need, right? If food, I need diapers, food stamps don't buy diapers, right? They can then allocate that money according to what they actually need, right?
Absolutely. One of the
So
things that this reminds me of an argument that Friedrich Hayek makes in this. He didn't write The Servile State, excuse me. The Road to Serfdom. In that book, he said that one of the reasons why totalitarian regulated economies that provide you with the essentials of life, thinking of the Soviet style economy, are worse is because if you ever have to receive a decrease in your income, you get to decide where the retrenchment falls. You get to decide what is a necessity and what is a luxury good, rather than
right,
having someone else make those determinations for you. And I also think that there is, like you were saying, that the trust placed in individuals is that is a value in and of itself. To say we respect you as a sovereign individual to the extent that you should own your own choices. You should receive support, but also own your own choices.
yeah, 100%, 100%. And and that's like I said, that's why I'm not against UBI as a concept. Like I'm in favor of it. I just think that the way that I'm a much bigger proponent of this lump sum allocation, because yeah, like I said, it just changes people's mindset in the way that it seems to lower this risk of lifestyle expansion, and instead seems to promote more sort of long term thinking.
Interesting. Interesting. I like that as a value. My co-host with this program is also named Joseph, coincidentally, and he refers to something he calls the optimist doctrine, which is that any choice that you make should optimize not just for the now and not just for the future, but it needs to harmonize across both. Any choice you make needs to be good both now and in the future, neither one
Mhm.
at the full expense of the other. And I think that's an interesting idea that I don't know where the ideas that guide our money habits come from, because some of them are incentives, but a lot of them are cultural. A lot of options do not even occur to people
Yeah,
as options. You just go to school, you go to college, then you go into the workforce, and then you get a mortgage, and then hopefully you've saved enough for retirement, but by the numbers you have not. And I'm curious about alternatives, including ideas like Mr. Borsodi's going off grid. Partially, he had one foot in the grid, one foot out, and he was
yeah,
a major fan of purchasing labor-saving equipment on loans if he thought that he would be able to recoup enough time to justify it as if it were a business expense. So he treated his home financials as though they were business financials, which I think is a very useful way to go about thinking.
yeah. Sounds very sensible. I think your co-host is correct that, like, yes, like we should have this like optimal um, attitude to our decision making between now and future. The problem is, from a psychological point of view, we are, and I hate using this phrase, but we are hardwired to focus on the now, because generally speaking, like evolutionarily speaking, I don't know if you believe in evolution, but evolutionarily speaking, right, as a caveman species, it was much more important for us to focus on what's right now than what's going to be happening in 3 years' time, right? Because if you're trying to survive in the wild, and the option is like, do I like eat this thing now, or do I try and like, I don't know, plant it so then I can reap the rewards of it, later. It was generally better to like deal with the now, right? Um, and so our brains have this very strong what we call present bias,
Yeah.
right? And so long
Parabolic
term
time
thinking
discounting.
is much harder. Yeah, long term thinking is much harder in general. And so while I agree that there should be this kind of balance, generally speaking, we're like way off balance in the short term direction. And so anything that gets people to think a little bit more towards that middle is normally better for people's finances.
That's one of the reasons why I found your video so fascinating, is because one of the biggest arguments for UBI traditionally has been that for those on the bottom rungs of society, their present needs become so strong in their minds that they can't get a leg up and get out of a cycle of poverty. And so the theory was that simply by giving the extra resources, that monthly universal basic income, you could expand that time threshold. And what this study has shown via the decrease in net wealth is that that doesn't seem to be entirely true. I wonder, to a large extent, I think we are hardwired for it. And I think that's actually a good thing. It is helpful to take care of present needs so that you can have a future to have future needs in. That having been said, the agency that human beings have to navigate that by conscious choice is, it's not absolute. Try arguing with yourself and you will frequently lose. But there is a bandwidth where you can expand your faith in that the future is a thing and it's something that you should think toward. As I've been teaching my kids, I had my son was having a temper tantrum, which is a thing that happens, and he was making declarations and of hatred toward me and his siblings and everything, the universe in general, and was starting to self-sabotage, like tear things down in his room. And I said, hold on, does future you like that? Is that going to be good for future you? And he said, I hate future me. And I said, well, he kind of wants you to take care of him a little bit because you're going to be him very soon. And bringing that up explicitly has been very helpful in conversations with him where he'll say, future me doesn't want this. And it is helping him to modulate his behavior in the present. So
Yeah.
to a degree, it has to be learnable. And to the extent that cultural messages just get in the water and form some of our unspoken premises, I'm interested in playing with that divide. There's a hardwired component for sure, but there's enough bandwidth that I'd love to see culture push it in a greater direction. I've heard that language actually affects that, where if you speak a language that doesn't use tenses, then there's a correlation between that and taking better care of retirement.
I'm not surprised, right? There's lots of research that shows that like language dictates the way that we think, and if your language doesn't have a word for something, then you struggle to understand it as a concept. So yeah, I'm not surprised by that, and I love that practice of thinking, does future me like this? I think all of us should ask ourselves that question more often at any age. Does future me
Absolutely.
like what I'm doing right now? Yeah, it's a great way of thinking about things.
It is, although it does require some faith that future you will exist.
Yeah. So I want to pick up on something you said earlier about like um, that sort of main argument that people have for UBI, which is that the people who need it are so poor that their necessities are not met, and so that's why UBI is really important to kind of get them over that initial threshold where they can think more long term. And that's the argument I presented at the start of the video as well as like sort of the central argument for UBI. And one of the criticisms of this study was that people in this study weren't poor enough,
Ha!
right?
Interesting.
And I like it's very subjective as to like what is poor enough, right? And so, but some people were looking at this study and they were like, well, you know, that amount of money is not poor enough where that kind of thing would happen. So yeah, and also like the other thing as well is that like people's definition of poor enough and people's definition of essentials is like very different, right? Depending on who you are and where you live. And I talked about another study that was done in Liberia, another UBI study that was done in Liberia as a comparison. The people living in Liberia are, in terms of like objective quality of life, way worse than the poorest American, right? Like they are, living in huts made of mud with grass roofs. You know what I mean? Like that's the level of like poverty we're talking here,
And not even as a
and
vacation.
and not as a luxury vacation. Yeah, certainly not. Like that, they live there all the time, and so it was interesting what happened when you gave these people UBI is that they didn't spend it on what you would think is necessities like food. and stuff like that. Instead, to them, necessities was getting a metal roof.
A metal roof. I remember.
Yeah,
That's a
you remember
fascinating
this? Yeah,
example.
because the grass roofs were rubbish. The grass roofs didn't keep the water out. They need to be repaired every year. The grass they need to buy is expensive, and so like you can see this is actually quite complex long term decision making that these people are engaging in. They're like, I know that this is like a major cost to me long term. That is not only costing me a lot of money, but is also leading to me having a poor quality of life because I have a leaky roof. And so they're able to like say, well, I don't need this extra money to pay for my food. I need this extra money to pay for my roof. And so, what is actually poor enough? If these people are so poor and they're still able to engage in that kind of long term decision making, then it kind of begs the question, like, you know, are people who are poor really struggling with that kind of long term decision making? It doesn't seem to be.
Absolutely. With
Yeah.
with financial health, I think it is probably best measured in time. How long can you go with current resources at present level of expenditures without additional income? And
Yeah.
if that amount is negative, that's a problem. If that amount is a day, that's decent, but you're hand to mouth. But ideally, that should be stretched out into the weeks and months, and maybe decades. And in order to get that to work, you've got the expenses side, and you've got the income side. And I've always been fascinated with reducing the expenses side, partially because of a thing my dad did. So my dad got a mortgage, and he's very sensitive to the risk involved in debt, and really does not like debt. So think of him as kind of a Dave Ramsey character. Just it gets under his skin, and he hated the feeling of being in a mortgage. And so he came up with many harebrained schemes to get out of the mortgage faster, around starting some business in the garage, and fortunately most of those did not happen. But then he struck on an idea. He had an extra long lot with the house that we had. And so what he did is he subdivided the lot, sold the house, moved into my grandparents' basement next door, built a house from scratch using the proceeds from the house in front, and managed to get out completely from the mortgage. And then swore in his wrath that he would never get in debt ever again. And so that is essentially his life insurance policy. He doesn't carry a life insurance policy that I'm aware of, because if he were ever to pass away, my mother and my siblings would never lack a house. It just isn't on the table. And
Yeah.
I think that idea, if you were to take it even further and say solar panels on the roof, large garden, there's some expenses you'll never get away from, taxes and medical care, top of the list. But
Yeah.
I love that idea.
Yeah. Yeah. That's an amazing story from your dad, and full kudos to him for doing that. Amazing. But as somebody who worked at a bank, right? Like one of the things that I'm very concerned with in my day to day work is vulnerable customers, right? So like who are our customers who are most likely to end up in poor financial situations? How can we anticipate that? How can we predict that before it happens so that we can offer help at an earlier stage, right? And so that I spend a lot of my day thinking about these things, and like one of the main things that we look at is financial resilience, right? So it's like, exactly as you said, let's look at your weekly or monthly expenditure. Let's look at your savings, like how much cash do you have, and how long would you be able to survive? And if it's like a lot less than your expenditure, then it's like, well, you're not in a good position. And the interesting thing with this study was that they actually measured that. So they measured people's financial resilience after 3 years, and again, no improvement over the control, which is just, you know what I mean? If you just took the $1,000 a month and put it in a savings account every single month, that would have significantly improved. And if you're very poor, that is like a high priority to build up this savings so that you can absorb a shock, right? So
Yeah.
that you lose your job, your partner dies, whatever, emergency medical treatment, or even just something as simple as like your boiler broke, right? And you got to pay a plumber to come and fix it. That something as small as that can send people into a spiral of short-term loans and debt sometimes. And so just having that little bit of resilience is super important. And yet you gave people $36,000 and they didn't build up any additional resilience. It is it's a huge failure. I don't know how. There's no, in my opinion, there's no other way to view it. It's a massive failure. But yeah, people in the comments will disagree.
I agree. I agree completely. I wonder what the best ways to get that problem solved for a greater number of people. It is individual choices are an available option for the individual. Individuals can try to get their expenditures in order, move to a smaller house, save the extra money, throw it toward debt, get themselves taken care of. But I wonder if the solution isn't a better story. If we need an orienting story related to finances and the future that is better than sitting on a beach as a non-working 65-year-old. You know, something that speaks more about shocks to the system, so that when I think of savings, I remember distinctly when I was 10 or 11 years old, my mom was trying to explain to me that you need to save some money, and I thought, what for? The money is for getting things. And she said, well, you need to have some savings. And I couldn't picture what savings were for. And I didn't have that idea of a buffer to absorb shocks. I had it only in terms of saving up for large purchases. And, that's what that's for. So.
Right. Yeah, exactly. Exactly. And so, yeah, I as a behavioral scientist, I would advocate that, like, if this scheme was to be done, that it would be done in less of a pure way as it was. Like, it was done in a very pure way where it's just like, here's $1,000. We're not going to give you any guidance. We're not going to give you any advice. Nothing. Like, just have the money, and we're just going to measure what happens. Which is the pure version of UBI. I think a more intelligent distribution would be to be like, here's $1,000. Also, here's some reading material. Here's some, like, a video that we're going to recommend that you watch about ideas of how you can use that money to improve your position. You don't have to listen to it. If you want to spend it all on alcohol or gambling, go for it. But here's just some ideas. Maybe pay off your debt, right? Maybe put it in a savings account where it earns some interest. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And just like nudge people a little bit, just to consider maybe spending the money in a sort of long-term way. But without any kind of obligation to do so. And
So as to
I
have
reckon you'd have better
minimum
results.
necessary force. You want just enough instruction that it's pointed in a direction without it becoming paternalistic, like we were discussing
Yeah,
earlier. It's a
it's
difficult
just a
needle to thread.
suggestion. Yeah, it's just a suggestion, or even your nudge for your son. Like, maybe spend the money how future you would like. And just have people think. Just something as simple as that, I reckon, could have changed the outcome of this pretty substantially.
I wonder if the
Yeah,
name of the program would affect it that way. Like, call it a gift to future you or something like that. Just, I
I
mean,
love that.
legislation
Yeah,
gets named in order to skew the polls. I think we could do something similar with the program.
totally, totally, totally. Yeah.
I'd be
Um,
interested to see in other places, just speaking in terms of governmental policy, that the United States has some aging infrastructure problems. We have aging roads that need to be taken care of. Those were developed during the Cold War in order to intimidate the Russians, and it worked, but unfortunately, that hasn't been a pressing concern for a very long time. And fortunately, that hasn't been a pressing concern for a long time. I don't want to discount that. I'm glad that we haven't been nuked. But in terms of our energy grid, we've run into problems as well recently with over optimization and aging components and unexpected. We don't have a lot of buffer built into the energy grid. And especially as we're moving toward renewables and thinking about energy storage, I think grid scale storage is one possible solution. Another possible solution is every single roof gets solar. And we start there. And every single home gets a battery. And so blackouts are no longer a grid scale problem, they are a home scale problem. And it's something that you can go and, borrow some power from your neighbor. I would
right.
love to see that level of shock resistance and resilience and, another bill reduced. If that was the way that we took care of the national scale problem was by building individual scale resiliency en masse, that's one more bill eliminated from the list.
Yeah, totally. I love that idea. And or if everyone's driving an electric car with a big battery, then that can be your energy, right? if you
Absolutely.
need to. right?
I actually
Yeah,
think that that is an unsung option with electric cars. I would love one to use as a home backup battery. And
it's a thing. It's a thing.
yeah,
So yeah, there are some cars that can do it already. Yeah.
that's awesome. I'm not sure how well the solar thing would work in the UK, but
Yeah, yeah, probably would. Yeah, could maybe power one light bulb a year, something like that.
something like that. That's awesome.
Yeah.
Pete, thank you so much for the conversation. This has been delightful. Do you have any closing thoughts that you'd like to leave us with?
Yeah, I just yeah, thank you for having me. First of all, obviously, I love having these conversations with folks like yourself. It's always great to meet people, so appreciate it. Thanks for the invite. I just want to say, I want to be very clear. I am not against UBI as a concept, right? I just think the way that it was implemented here is not ideal, and also the way that they reported on the results was very sneaky to make it look a lot better than it really is. But in general, I am in favor of some version of UBI, not this version, but some version of it. And I don't hate poor people. Let's make that very clear. I do think that if people need help, we should give it to them. Yeah.
Sad that that needs to be said, but I'm grateful. Thank you so much for the conversation. And where can I see there's the a silver YouTube play button right behind you? Where can people find you?
There is. Yeah, it's just if you search Pete Judo on YouTube, you'll find me there, or Pete Judo on any of my other socials, you'll also find me there as well.
Wonderful. Thank you so much.